of it. But let me just thank Dr. Sheff and Dr. Alan for their range of perspectives and issues to think about. Certainly, China and India are going to be players. There's just no question about that, as well as the other emerging markets. This is the new world, and they will matter to the prosperity of our future and to the global economy. And this is just not disputed. But there are a lot of questions about what this change will actually look like, which countries will be successful and why, and what a multipolar world how it will actually function. Because that is the new stage, especially since the Second World War in any case. And some of these answers may vary by sector and location within these economies, as well as globally. So we may not have one answer across the board. But I think Dr. Alan's point that to expect continuous linear growth in these economies is not wise, right? That we would expect ups and downs despite the successes that we've seen to date, but there's no guarantee of what that's going to look like in the future. Likewise, a lot of these issues raised with respect to governance, but also resources and currencies, I think will make that growth filled with surprises, shall we say. that will look very different than the kinds of growth paths that we've seen in the past. And so that's really our challenge to sort out, depending on which industry you're in, what that will look like in these different parts of the world. So I see there is a question. I will start with Anita.
Thank you very much. It's been a fairly thought-provoking insight. My fundamental question is talking about innovation and disruption, and the role of technologies. I know there's governance, there's opportunity, but there's some amount of democratization that's happening, which is not just overthrowing governance in the case of Tunisia and Egypt and that part of the world, using technology as the basis, or rather a catalyst, which is kind of triggering that. But fundamental transformative changes are happening both on the governance, political level, as well as what the ensuing opportunities it's going to create from a market standpoint. So I'd like for you both to comment on disruptive thinking and innovation, and how that ties into this bigger framework.
So, if there's one thing that the Chinese don't want, is disruption. There's one thing that I think that is one of the stated goals of the Chinese policymakers is harmony, social harmony. So that means that the internet is highly controlled, and companies like Google, of course, had to leave China only to benefit companies like Baidu, who stayed in China, and now the Baidu CEO turns out is now the richest or the second richest entrepreneur in China. He's in his 30s, and he's one of the wealthiest people in the world. Because to some extent the government has cleared the way for him to take over China. It's now the preferred search modality in China. So we assume, by the way, that when we're looking at the internet, that this is just a kind of a global phenomenon. My own research into it suggests that much of the discussion happens, and much of the use of technology actually happens within a country. And I think China is monitoring the internet, and monitoring internet use, and monitoring what people at different levels of society think about the government. So I have a friend, for example, who works for the Shanghai Social Science Academy, and he conducts regular surveys of people in different socioeconomic status and of academics to see what they think about the government. So it's highly monitored, obviously highly controlled in China. India, the stories there.
Can that continue? Can that sustain? How long do you think they'll be able to do that?
Yes, I think it can be sustained. I think that the security apparatus in China is highly developed and highly monitored. And I actually think that you assume that when you think about dictatorship, and this usually happens with a lot of people living in America and other developed democracies, is that we assume that just because China is a dictatorship, that the government does not have legitimacy. And that's not in fact the case. And I think that in China, in fact, most people do believe that a government is doing a decent job. Now, part of it is propagated by CCTV, but despite CCTV, I think that people even trust the national government more than they even trust the local government. And they want the national government to be strong, and they want the national government to be successful in its policies. So, to a large extent, I think China has done a good job galvanizing the society and suppressing dissent to a large extent. When, in fact, that will end, your guess is as good as mine, because in the reality, if you look at the Chinese history, it's full of dynasties. And I look at the current regime as just another, the Communist Party is another dynasty, if you will. And it's going to last for some time, and eventually it will go away and something else will replace it. And I think that's just the nature of the way things are.
No. Major technologies always have been disruptive. Railroads made more change in terms of really creating mobility of products. You could make it here, distribute some other place. Then of course we have the automobile, which probably has been more revolutionary than we imagined the impact of the automobile in daily lives, as well as in governance functions in many ways. Happened with television. Television has been very disruptive. Before that, when the way the media was managing content that would be available, this came about, and internet is the next one. Each one has much bigger wave of impact coming on. The technology evolution was taking place. That's my field. I work on a lot today. The problem is the side effects of those technologies. And I'll digress very for a moment. We have been analyzing this from 1992-93. I came here for Bell South. Before the internet became as a word, we were worrying about what happens to the impact. There are 4 major negative impacts of the internet. Internet is very addictive. BlackBerry is simple. And the addiction is a big worry among governments, more so than disruption in the world. Internet makes artificial real, which is the one that I do a lot of research personally. There is no way in the age of internet you can ever govern the intellectual property rights that were designed in the industrial age, manufacturing age. It's impossible. So we have to change the laws. I think Elon's second point was to change the institutions. I'm working right now quite a lot about how do you protect your intellectual property rights without legal governance. There are many other governance mechanisms other than the legal governance, which is what we're doing. That's the second major impact. Internet also can be very useful technology for deviancy in society. So the rise of deviancy creates enormous pressure on institutions, whether it's a religion as an institution, government as an institution, or education as an institution. We worry quite a lot in the classroom, what is the appropriate student behavior in the age of the iPad? Should they have the iPad in the class? Should they be text messaging while they're listening to the professor? We go through all those debates. So it has an impact on all institutions, not just the government. That's very key to understand. So I'm looking at the side effects. It's an important drug, but we need to understand not the efficacy, but its side effects. The key 2-3 observations is that technology will be a greater enabler in creating democratization of wealth. Very key. This technology has been enabling more people to become millionaires, which was not possible in the industrial age. If you look at the amount of money they have made, from Bill Gates on the one hand to Azim Premji that I sit on the board, they all become millionaires out of this technology in some fashion. The key thing is that once you democratize wealth, you cannot govern the same way like a dynasty. It's very true in the feudal society, any form of an autocratic government system, so you have to democratize governance. This technology is a great asset for a government to democratize governance. And last comment, which is somewhat related but not directly to your question, there are two types of weddings from a governance viewpoint. You have a Western wedding, we call it Christian wedding, which is highly governed. It is planned out. Chinese economy runs like that, for your information. Chinese Politburo runs like that. It's governed. Everybody is predictable, their behavior. The wedding takes place as you had planned. There is a rehearsal after rehearsal, which is policy document, right? The priest is on time, everybody is on time, they know exactly what to say and the wedding is over. Have you attended an Indian wedding? It's like another governance mechanism. Wedding does take place, okay, but nobody is in charge. Either you have one person in charge as a governance mechanism, or you have everybody in charge as a governance mechanism. Mirika's point this morning was that if this was a strictly Northern European culture, like a Germanic culture, we would be always on time, which is the same as a Mandarin culture, but not true of the Cantonese culture. It's very much like, manana, who cares? When it begins, enjoy the ride. Why are you obsessed about governance? When it begins, when it ends, it's going to happen. Very interesting perspective. This technology will make sure that the governance is distributed. This technology is very distributive in nature. So you create governance using this technology, empowering people to govern themselves, or create communities of governance rather than a central government dictating this what we do. And I want to make comments there because they're different. Just as we have a perspective on China and India, and this is a comment that I must tell you is a part of something that I arranged, because I came to this country in '61, and all my students were Americans. And I didn't know how to drive, I had no car. One of them was driving and suddenly he froze. Sense of fear. I said, what's happening? David Miller is his name. He said, there's a police car behind me. I said, so what? In India, we go and pat the policeman on the back and say, you are my servant. You work for me. Why do we fear police in this country, in a democratic country? Isn't that a contradiction? Isn't it interesting? You have to think. So when you see a reality in a nation, you cannot take your perspective and say, from that I see the world. You have to be probably more liberal about your perspective. So I still fear police. Why? Because I was brainwashed in this country that police is a force of enforcement. They're not my friends. They're out there to do vigilance. They're out there to basically, give me tickets. They're out there to, whatever it is. Why should that view of police be in America? Isn't this a democracy? With a different perspective. I can talk about that and question, therefore, the true governance in America. And I can talk about where the governance is separate issue, technology, I already answered. We'll have one more question. We can debate the same way. The whole advantage is more time to debate, right? So.
On that point of innovation and different weddings, there's a new book published by Dan Bresnitz and Michael Murphy at Georgia Tech called The Run of the Red Queen that makes a very thorough argument about different trends, two different trends, one that is more state-run, one is more connected to the global economy type of innovation that is well worth taking a look at in answer to this question and some of the general issues that we've talked about. So time for one more question, please.